Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. From time to time, North Carolina people likes to introduce you to organizations and individuals who are doing very creative and imaginative work all over the world, and they are partially based in North Carolina. So it's true of Apt Associates. It's a public policy determining agency that does a lot of very important research work for nations and societies all over the world. The research arm is in the Triangle. Karl Feld is the vice president, who does this directing of all this inquiry work that goes on. He's had a very interesting, creative, and imaginative experience up to now, and we're going to talk with him in just a few seconds.
Sponsored in part by Wachovia, a Wells Fargo company, helping North Carolina people realize their financial goals since 1879. And through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC TV.
Well, I must say, after reading about what you've done at such an early age and the traveling you've done, half the globe is home to you in lots of ways, I'm sure. But how'd you get in this fascinating work of research and exploration?
Well, I actually, at the time that I was a university student, was enrolled in an exchange program in Germany. And this was when the wall came down. And I actually rented a car, second day, drove to Berlin. I slept in the car for a week and helped them chip pieces off the wall. Mm-hmm. At the time, I had wanted to be an Army officer. And be deployed in Europe to protect the West, and that all just sort of blew away overnight. But I saw the next stage in that process of creating a more peaceful world and being to help rebuild Eastern Europe, now that it had become open and accessible to everyone again. So I entered the field of development, and it really went on from there. For a while, I worked in technical assistance, actually working to build democratic governments in post-communist states. And then one day, I was doing a political poll in Russia for the Yeltsin campaign. Mm-hmm. And I discovered I really like polling. Polling is really exciting. And I had a job offer to transition into doing polling in the United States for political parties. And that's how I got into applied research, which is what I do today.
Fascinating work. Let's suppose one of the governments in the Middle East calls your home office, Apt Associates. We need some help here. We need some help in rebuilding a water system or a sewer system. But we don't know how to go about this, or we don't know what to do. What does your company do then?
The parent company, Apt Associates, is a consulting company that specializes in improving the quality of life for people and their economic well-being. They mostly do that through consulting assignments. So for this particular case, they would advise the government of Iraq on how to apply technologies and change behaviors, which is an important element to the whole thing,
yes.
To improve water distribution and usage. The primary company, the Apt Associates, would be involved in the consulting and analysis and econometrics and other forms of measurement and policy advice. And then Apt SRBI, where I work, would be involved in collecting and analyzing primary data. So applying social science techniques on the ground to the Iraqi people to figure out how implementation might affect them and how to better implement.
How extensive is that example in the work that's going on throughout the Middle East with corporate America and these countries seeking to redirect themselves? Is this a pretty widespread practice in what you've just characterized?
Iraq is its own animal, so we should set that aside for a minute. But the majority of the work is not funded by local governments, and it's not funded privately. It's funded by international donor organizations like the UN, or unilaterally by Western governments who have a policy interest in investing. So USAID here in the United States, GTZ in Germany, DFID in the United Kingdom. There's a huge array of assistance organizations. But having said that, yes, there's a significant amount of money being spent to help these countries improve themselves.
Now, when you see an array of countries like you've seen experiencing this internal turmoil in recent months, do you have to approach each culture very differently? You have to understand that what works in Egypt doesn't work in Iraq, or what would work in Libya won't do in Turkey, or so forth. In your application, you're a social scientist. You have developed techniques of discovery and application. Are each cultures that distinctly different? Do these require almost different teams for you every time?
Yes, it's an interesting phenomenon. In the Arabic-speaking world is a good example because they share a common language, to a certain extent, a common religion, some common values and practices. So you would think there's a certain degree of homogeneity there, but there's not. Every one of those countries is different. The beauty to what I do in applying social science methods in different environments is that what is good science and what is not good science is, for the most part, universally understood. There's a common culture, if you will, of intellect across the world that can do what I do and talk about what I talk about with others using a common language. And that's the language of statistics for the most part. And that creates opportunities to find fact, to seek what is true and what is false, that may not quite be so possible in other contexts. Now, having said that, how you go about finding those facts is highly variable depending upon what country you're working in. And that's where the culture comes into play. Because the way I ask questions of people in Iran, for example, if I were to do that, would be completely different than the way I would ask questions of people in Egypt, depending upon my topic.
So when you're putting together a team to go into a given country, you try first to find the scholar who is of that nation, that nationality, that experience, that history. Is that what you do?
One of the things that's fascinating about my industry, if you will, the market research or the opinion research industry, is that it's a fairly new business, right? It was created arguably commercially after the Second World War. And only in the last 20, 15 years has it actually reached out to all the remotest corners of the planet. So today, you can literally, except for some places in Africa and some Pacific islands, you can literally find a commercial enterprise that does what I do almost anywhere.
Really?
Yes. How well they do it is a matter of debate. But again, that common language exists. And so, yes, I always try to find a local resource if there's one available, both because they understand how to operate in that culture, which can be difficult, and also because part of what Apt Associates and Apt SRBI do is to build local capacity. So it's part of our corporate mission statement to help that local business become more able to do what we do. So in a sense, I'm creating a partner, I'm building a network, and at the same time, I'm improving the country where that company is located. But you're right, there's an element to it where I couldn't possibly do it by myself. I could not show up in Uganda tomorrow and collect data. I can't do it. I'm not Ugandan. I'm not even African. I would not get honest answers from people because I'm not a local.
How do you measure then the competence of people you're going to retain? You find most of these have some smattering of Western culture in the sense of educational experience at some level, whatever it may be. Is the Western culture has it permeated that deep?
Yeah, I don't characterize, I would disagree with you, and I would not characterize university education as necessarily Western.
Well,
Folks
no.
in the Arab world would argue that a lot of it comes from them originally.
Well, it certainly did.
However, in essence, yes, the idea is that you find people who have that shared knowledge and experience, which usually implies a PhD in a social science. And they've acquired that knowledge, for the most part, from a regional university. They aren't always educated in the West, because statistics is, for the most part, it's a hard science.
It certainly is.
It's either right or it's not right. I mean, statisticians would argue with me on that statement, but for commercial purposes, there's a right way to do it and there's a wrong way to do it. And there's very little gray area. And so people can be educated at a university and other places in the West to do it. In fact, I know many very good researchers who have never been to the West at all. Having said that, that is the idea, though. Generally, you either find a firm headed by one of these people, or if there is no firm, you find one of these people who's interested in undertaking this task, which is significant, and then you work with them. Now, to answer the rest of your question, I will usually sit down and have a conversation or two with whoever or whatever firm we've chosen. Just have a basic discussion. How would you do this? What would it look like? Okay, well, I would change it this way. Here's the literature relevant to what we're talking about. Do you agree? Right? It's an academic, scholarly conversation, informed by research and literature review. And if I find somebody who can have that kind of a conversation and can understand where we want to go and agrees or disagrees with a knowledgeable manner, he can convince me otherwise, which happens, we have a partner.
In all of the wealth of experience that you've gathered, what universality have you found? Where's the common thread?
That's very interesting. You should bring that up. I conducted a study across most of the Muslim world on the rights of women as they perceive it themselves, which was brand new at the time. And part of what I was doing in conducting that study was to try to look for a universal thread. What is it about women in the Muslim world that drives their attitudes and behaviors towards their rights? Because they're highly variable. Even though the rights are consistent, they're defined by the United Nations. Were there any threads? And I found threads. The threads tend to be economic. They tend to be what resources do you have available to you? What kind of conditions do you live in? What's the future prognosis for advancing yourself, right? Can you promote your social well-being and your quality of life, the missions of our company? If you can, you tend to be happier about your situation. Or if there are laws preventing you from doing what you want to do, you tend to be unhappier about your situation. Whereas surprisingly, folks in very wealthy countries, for example, the United Arab Emirates is a good example. Arabs who are living under a Sharia law system, Arab women don't mind too much. But that's because they have almost everything they could possibly want.
Well, it's an interesting study you've had there. What do you find to be the corporate attitude in your work, backing away from the specific project? You've had a chance to assess the appearance of the American corporate world in all of these nations. How are we accepted?
I don't know that I can say that how the corporate world is perceived, but I can certainly talk about how we are perceived.
Yes, well, that's...
There is generally a distinction between Americans as a people and America as a country. And there are a number of publicly available polls on this information. It's not unique to me. But the Americans as a people, as individuals, as groups, are generally viewed either neutrally, depending on who you're talking to, or favorably. America as a country, America as a government, tends to rate much lower, depending on who you're talking to. And that's generally because the populations associate foreign policy as they experience it with our government, not with us. To what degree that reflects their experience of their separation and distance from their own governments, which are often not democratic, I can't say. I suspect there's part of that in there. And part of it is they're able to disambiguate, what Karl Feld on the street believes, talking to you today on the sidewalk in Lebanon, and what the Secretary of State said yesterday about U.S. policy. Most of them can do that, and they do.
When you were working in Egypt, that country's always been a place of great fascination to Americans. I made the journey up and down the Nile like every other tourist, but it's an ancient culture, but there's a lot of ferment there. What have you found working in that nation?
Wow, I've spent a lot of time in Egypt. It's a fascinating place. Egypt has a phenomenon, I would argue, driven by media, right? Which is not unique to Egypt, actually. It's occurring throughout most of the Levant and North Africa, where Egyptian youth, which far outnumbers older generations, they have an inverted population pyramid, have been exposed to things from the outside world by free-to-air media, by satellite media, especially television, which they want and they can't get. Well, they couldn't until recently, let's say, until about 4 months ago. Yeah. So they have a completely different outlook on the world than their parents, their government until recently. Well, some would argue their government still. And it's one that looks for more freedom of expression, more participation, more what we would traditionally call a democratic society, right? Now, how that democratic society manifests itself in Egypt is up for grabs, because Egypt has also had, in the last 10 years or so, an increasingly religious conservative element to it, not politically, but culturally. Which, given that its primary opposition party has always been a Islamic party, the two things tend to just sort of come together in the new environment.
When you go into a nation to do a specific study, you spend a lot of time understanding that culture, being able to communicate in that culture so that it's not you bringing your ideas and superimposing something. You have to work toward building an understanding on their part of what you're doing, you on their part.
Absolutely. And that's part of the relationship, the sharing of minds and discussion that I have with a local partner, because there's no way I don't speak Arabic. There's no way I can understand how my question design is going to be communicated in Arabic, right? Let alone impact the people of Egypt, for example. I have to have an Egyptian look at it and think about it. And then there's also a process where you take your experimental design and you test it. You test it on Egyptians, and you get their feedback. How did this question resonate with you? What does it mean? Does it mean this? Does it mean that? If I ask it this way, what does it mean, right? And you have to take all that in and decide which formulations, which designs get you where you want to go, because often they're not what you think they are. A classic example of that keeps coming up over and over and over again is democracy. What is democracy? What does democracy mean to an Egyptian? What does it mean to an Afghan, right? I was involved in research at one point where there was an election coming up for the president's office, and an Afghan in a village said, "Why are we doing this? Didn't we elect a king last year?" I mean, the whole concept of representative democracy doesn't even exist. So if you write a question for them, a scale question, something like, how democratic do you feel your government is today, or that's very generic, but something like that, they don't understand the middle word, or they understand it differently. They mean I'm putting another king into the royal house. That question is not going to work.
How long is it going to take the process and the United Nations and others to teach that difference and to get the inculcation of whether it's the literal democratic notion or some variation?
There's a question of whether you can teach it. And this is much debated. There's no answer on this topic. But scientists in the field of political anthropology would tell you that a manifestation of a democratic system, a system of representation in any given culture, has to be built into the way that culture or society works. You can't necessarily impose another model. I spent a number of years building Western models in other countries, and I came to the conclusion that that approach just doesn't work. You can give them a parliament, but that doesn't mean much, you know? So to answer your question, I don't think anybody's figured out the right answer yet. I don't think anybody's figured out how to do it right every time. And so nobody really knows how long it's going to take.
Is that the reason our government then has so much difficulty in some of these countries? You're saying there's a great difference between acceptance of you as an American and the acceptance of the American government itself and the foreign policy it promulgates. And this gets to be pretty difficult, doesn't it?
It can be if you're attempting to assist others in the name of the United States government. You know, there are rules, there are ground rules for that. The local government has to invite them in. They have to be approved, accepted. But then you get into issues of dealing with the population as a whole, right? Okay, so my government said these Americans were cool, but I don't like them.
Well, you're back at Georgetown. You're in front of their scholars in foreign policy. They have a wonderful school in that field up there. It's a great university. They've got you up there lecturing. Mr. Feld, what's the experience you want to communicate to these embryo Foreign Service officers about the way to approach the nations of the world that you have experienced? What would you say to these young people?
You know, I actually said this once to a Foreign Service officer candidate many, many years ago, and I still believe it's true. The first thing I would say to them is get out of the embassy. To the extent that you can, because there are rules about that, get out of the embassy, mix with the locals. Because you can't influence them the way that you might unless you mix with them. And we're not talking about the ministers and the government officials. We're talking about the real people, right? I always found I got far more understanding out of, you know, going to a dinner party that had no other Americans at it, or visiting my employee's hut, literally, in the village while he collected food for the next week at the office. I got far more out of that, and I think they got far more out of me doing that than I ever got talking to government officials.
Are you saving all this experience and going to give us a book soon?
Several people have asked me that, and I am. I take notes. I take extensive notes every time I go anywhere, and I'm piling them up with that thought in mind.
Well, it certainly is important because you're seeing something, you're seeing a part of the world in transition like nobody else. And you're at it at that level, the hut, you're talking to the fellow out there pumping the gas. Have you learned some startling lessons yourself?
I think I have. And some of them I try to pass on to my children, two of whom are native North Carolinians.
Good.
One of them is that most people are pretty much good. Most people value the same things. And we as Americans have so much more than others that we should be very proud of that and thankful.
I think that latter part is so important, teaching people that we are abundant, and we sometimes lose sight of that. But when you see the films we've seen of the children in Somalia or in Ethiopia and see the starvation You've been there, you've seen it yourself. It must be pretty heart-wrenching at times.
Yeah, it is, and you wish you could help everybody,
Mm-hmm.
but you can't. You just can't reach out and do that.
Can't thank you enough for sitting down with me, talking about your very interesting life and enriching life, and I hope you will get that book out to some of us sometime soon. And friends, I know you've enjoyed learning what we've all learned from listening to this world traveler who does such creative and important work all over the world. So next week then, good night.
Sponsored in part by Wachovia, a Wells Fargo company, helping North Carolina people realize their financial goals since 1879. And through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC TV.